Welcome to NPP's webinar, Hitting the Debt Ceiling, What Does It Mean? Hitting the Debt Ceiling is the latest webinar in NPP's Data for Democracy series. I'm your presenter, Ann Werboff, a research analyst with the National Priorities Project and a doctoral candidate in economics at the University of Massachusetts. This webinar will run approximately 20 minutes. In addition to this presentation, which is available on our website, we also have a set of talking points that includes resources where you can find additional information related to this topic. Plus, you can follow NPP's work through a range of social media, and I'll discuss more on that later. There's a lot of misinformation about this issue. The most egregious is the impression that raising the debt ceiling is linked to major spending cuts. For example, House Speaker John Boehner said on April 9th that, quote, "Without significant spending cuts and reform to reduce our debt, there will be no debt limit increase," end quote. A recent CNN poll showed that 60% of Americans oppose raising the federal debt ceiling. Yet there's no legal requirement linking raising the debt ceiling to spending cuts or any other changes in fiscal policy. They are two separate issues. So the goal of our presentation is to give you a better understanding of the context and history of the ongoing debate and a clearer understanding of who's saying what. This way, we hope you will better to be able to engage on the issue. So let us begin. As we said, there's a lot of discussion going on about our country's debt and what it means for the economy. And we know that Congress will vote very soon on whether to raise the debt ceiling. So this webinar will explain the debt ceiling, deficits, and some issues like that. So let's begin with some definitions. First of all, what is a deficit? Well, a deficit occurs when the government spends more than it receives in taxes in a given year. So then what is the federal debt? The federal debt is the total amount that the government owes. It is the accumulation of past deficits. And the total national debt is the sum of the debt held by the public and debt held by federal accounts. These are two types of debt. So the public debt is the amount that the government has borrowed over the years to finance annual deficits. It's the value of the federal securities sold to the public. And public debt is held by international investors, including other governments, domestic private investors, the Federal Reserve, and state and local governments. Debt held by federal accounts, however, is debt held by the government itself. It is the result of surpluses in federal government accounts that have been invested in Treasury securities. This type of debt is held primarily in trust funds such as Social Security, Medicare, and the Civil Service Retirement Trust Fund. And we'll talk about both of those types of debt later on in our presentation. So why would governments need to borrow? Basically, they borrow when it's necessary to provide public services if revenues are not sufficient enough to fund these services. This creates a deficit, and historically, these deficits have increased due to wartime spending and economic downturns. There's a few examples: World War II, the Bush administration, which had the Iraq and Afghanistan wars and also tax cuts, the Obama administration, which had federal stimulus money, which was increased government spending, and decreased tax revenue, which had come from the rise in unemployment during the recession. A couple things to think about: as debt increases, so too does the interest owed. Now, that's assuming a constant interest rate. Now, the government must pay interest on the national debt to keep it current. Paying only the interest, however, does not pay down the debt or the principal. To reduce the debt, the government must run surpluses and use them to pay off the principal. And since 1901, there have been 31 annual surpluses. The longest period was during the 1920s boom, when we had a very strong economy. So let's look at a little bit of the history of the debt. Now, from the recent media coverage, you would think that the debt is a new phenomenon, but this is not the case. It is not new. In fact, it's been part of our U.S. economy from the very beginning, even from the early Revolutionary War. And we see that the debt has grown primarily due to wartime spending and economic recessions. And we've picked a few points in history showing some large increases in debt, again, mainly due to wars. I want to point out that in the 1835 date under President Andrew Jackson, when he reduced the debt to zero, well, this was quite an anomaly. He actually eliminated the central bank at the time, which was a precursor to the current Federal Reserve, and then he returned the bank's assets to the U.S. government, which created a surplus great enough to pay off the debt. Let's look in some more detail at the history of deficits and surpluses in this country. So first of all, a few points about the slides. All the numbers have been adjusted for inflation, and any points below the zero line are deficits, and anything above it are surpluses. So what we see is large deficits during World War II, followed by some small post-war surpluses. And then we're just running very small deficits until the deficits really began to increase under President Reagan. And President Reagan decreased tax rates and increased military spending. Then in the late 1990s, under President Clinton, we have some budget surpluses, and these were due to tax increases on the wealthy and increased tax revenues from the dot-com asset bubble. Under President George W. Bush, we see increased deficits, largely due to his administration's tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans and the middle class, as well as emergency supplemental bills that were used to fund the U.S. wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, the recent recession has really increased the size of the deficit inherited by President Obama. And the combination of lower tax revenues, which are due to higher unemployment on the one hand, and the expansion of need-based programs on the other, programs such as food stamps, Medicaid, and unemployment insurance, says the two together have really caused the deficit to increase. Our next slide shows the history of the debt. So a couple points about this slide. One is gross debt, the red line, would include the public debt, the yellow line, plus the difference would be the debt held by federal accounts. And secondly, we're using a debt as a percentage of GDP ratio. And this is a very common way to measure the size of the debt. So the GDP is the total income or output of a country. So the debt to GDP ratio is a little bit similar to a liability to assets ratio for an individual. It tells us how much a country owes and how much it can produce. However, note that debt is the accumulation of many years' deficits, while GDP is the output of a country in 1 year. So historically, this ratio has been in the 20 to 60% range. We see that it was largest during World War II. And here the ratio is about 120% of GDP. And this was, again, due to those large deficits the government ran to fuel the war effort. Now today we're at about 100%, saying that the size of the debt is approximately the same time as annual output. And again, remember, as the size of the debt grows, the government has to make larger and larger interest payments with money it could otherwise be using to fund public programs. So let's turn now to the debt ceiling. So the debt ceiling is simply the legal limit on borrowing by the Treasury that is set by Congress. The debt ceiling is similar to a personal credit card, though not exactly. But remember, raising the limit merely allows the government to continue to borrow. So a GAO report says, quote, that the debt limit does not control or limit the ability of the federal government to run deficits or incur obligations. Rather, it is a limit on the ability to pay obligations already incurred, end quote. So in other words, the debt comes from past year's deficits. So it needs to be raised even if the current deficit is cut. And just because there is a debt ceiling, this also does not prevent the government from running deficits. So they're two entirely different things. Think of it as deficit spending is about the current year's budget, while the debt comes from past year's budget. So this is important because a lot of the discussion is confounding these two issues and saying that they're linked. We must reduce spending next year if we're going to raise the debt ceiling. But by law, that is not the case. And so we can see that the first debt ceiling was set in 1917, and it's been raised 74 times since 1962, including 10 times since 2001. And our next slide shows a little bit of that history, at least since 2000, showing the changes in the debt ceiling and then as the debt has increased. So what's interesting is I bet most of you cannot remember the last time there was a vote on the debt ceiling. And there were 2 in 2009, 2 in 2008, but most of us won't be able to remember them because in the past, Congress's vote on the debt ceiling was very much a routine matter. It increased the debt ceiling in order to keep the government functioning. It's really the same situation today. What's different today is the political climate. So let's think a minute about all the different budget proposals currently being discussed. Now, they will all actually cause the level of debt to increase. So many of them propose to reduce the annual deficit by different amounts, but none of them actually produce a surplus in the short term. And again, remember, it's a budget surplus that's needed to reduce the debt. So 2 budget proposals were introduced in response to President Obama's budget for fiscal year 2012. One comes from House Budget Chairman Paul Ryan, and the other was by the Congressional Progressive Caucus. Now, the Congressional Progressive Caucus budget forecasts a surplus of $30 billion in 2021. However, Representative Ryan's budget does not even project a surplus until 2040. So again, when we're talking about these budget proposals, we need a surplus to reduce the size of the debt. Let's now talk about what happens if the current ceiling isn't raised. Well, in the short run, the Treasury could pay the interest on the debt first to avoid default, and they would do this before funding other federal programs. We know that monthly government receipts are greater than the monthly interest owed, so there is certainly enough cash to cover these interest payments. However, this means that government programs could lose some funding, things like as Social Security checks, soldier paychecks, things that are paid on a monthly and a regular basis. In the longer term, we would need to think about slashing government programs or increasing taxes in order to keep the debt under the current limit. So let's then turn to where our tax revenue comes from. So this slide shows the percentage of each revenue source, and now we're including the deficit and borrowing. And so what we can see is that borrowing makes up about a third. This was a fiscal year 2012 projections. Now, the other thing to note is that individuals, between our income taxes and the individual portion of social insurance taxes, and these are your payroll taxes, they pay the largest percentage overall of any entity paying taxes. Now, corporations pay a very small percentage. They pay 9%. But historically, that's not been the case. Until about the 1980s, corporations paid about 40% of their profits in taxes. Today, they're paying around about 25% of their profits, even though the official rate is 35%. And in 2010, we did some estimation. If corporations had paid that historical 40% rate, this would have produced an estimated $230 billion in revenues. And the last point I wanted to make out is that during an economic downturn, both corporate income taxes and individual income taxes decline because profits decline for corporations and individual income declines because more people are unemployed. So because of these two sources shrink, borrowing has to increase in order to meet the demands of the government programs. So let's say instead of paying the interest on the debt, let's say the government decided to keep their current programs intact. So that would mean it would default on its debt. It wouldn't pay the interest on Treasury bonds and other government securities. So what would happen is Treasury bonds would be downgraded and devalued. This would lessen their appeal for new investors. They're not going to want to buy them. And it would also impact investors who already hold these assets. Now remember, Treasury bonds are backed by the U.S. government. They're considered a risk-free, investment. So if you think about another country holding our Treasury bonds and we're not paying the interest on them, then when these bonds are devalued, it's not only going to affect the U.S. economy, but other economies too. So let's look at who owns our debt. Well, first of all, that initial distinction we made between public debt and debt held in federal accounts, public debt is 2/3, and the debt held in federal accounts is about 1/3. So let's look at debt held by federal accounts. So what we see here is that, again, this is the debt held by the federal government itself. And the largest portion is Social Security. They own over half. Then the Civil Service Retirement Fund, Trust Fund, and then Medicare, military retirement. These are other government programs. So again, the way to think about this is when these trust funds have surpluses, they want to invest in a risk-free asset. So they invest in treasury securities. And that's why they would hold this. And then at the same time, if these accounts need more money than they're taking in from other sources, they can then cash these in because these securities are considered very liquid. So debt held by the public is the other and the larger portion. And as we said, this is about 2/3 of all the debt. But of this, the largest portion, nearly half, is held internationally. And this would be both private investors overseas and, most importantly, central banks overseas. And then over 1/3 is held by domestic private investors. These could be individuals, these could be institutional investors, and most importantly, these could be pension funds. 9% is held by the Federal Reserve, and 8% is held by state and local governments. Now, you may wonder why the Federal Reserve is included in this debt held by the public. The Federal Reserve's holdings are counted because the Federal Reserve is independent of the government. So this is different from the debt held by federal accounts. So the Fed buys and sells Treasury securities as part of what's called its open market operations. And this is one way that the Federal Reserve controls interest rates in the economy. In terms of the international investors, China holds the most, which is about $1.1 trillion. This is followed by Japan, who owns about $800 billion. The Middle East oil exporting countries as a group hold about $173 billion, followed by Russia, then Brazil, and Taiwan. So if there's a default, it will affect U.S. citizens through their domestic holdings, through their state and local governments, because then those would have financial problems that would impact citizens of those states. And through our pension funds under here. And it's also going to affect the global economy through the international investors. So many, many people are going to be affected. Now, the current debate in Washington is really divided between opponents who say that we should not just raise the debt ceiling without, by just continuing to add to our debt, but that we must, also enact severe spending cuts, that the two must be linked. We should tie them. Now, proponents, and this would be like Treasury Secretary Geithner has said, it's the consequences of government default are so significant that this must be a straight up and down vote on whether or not we raise the debt ceiling. And then later, separate discussions could be held about what to do about the deficit. I'd like to sum up our webinar by just going over a few points. So first of all, the federal debt and annual deficits are two different things. Deficits result from a decline in revenues and an increase in government programs, and it is the accumulation of these deficits that make up the debt. And deficits add to the debt while surpluses reduce the debt. Again, debt is the result of past deficit spending. So the debt ceiling is this legal limit on borrowing set by Congress. It does not determine whether an annual budget will be balanced or run as a deficit or a surplus. Instead, it just serves as a total cap on borrowing. And there is no legal requirement that raising the debt ceiling be linked to changes in fiscal policy, such as a deficit reduction or a balanced budget. And while the current budget proposals reduce next year's deficit by differing amounts, none of them propose a surplus for fiscal year 2012, which is the only way to reduce a debt. So again, if we really want to reduce our debt long term, we need to be able to run government surpluses. We hope you enjoyed our presentation, Hitting the Debt Ceiling. We encourage you to go to our website and check out the additional information for this webinar. We've posted the slides there, also talking points. And you can also check out other MPP resources. We have Federal Budget 101 materials, and we have soon to be an updated database. If you'd like to be kept up to date on our activities and materials, we encourage you to sign up for our e-alerts, check out our Budget Matters blog, friend us on Facebook, or follow us on Twitter. So thank you again for your time. Feel free to follow up with us if you have any further questions or comments. You can contact us at nationalpriorities.org, at Facebook, at Twitter, or you can email us at info@nationalpriorities.org. Again, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the webinar.